resistance. So if we talk about this behavioral model, what we're talking about here is a model created perhaps 45 to 50 years ago, and it is called the stages of change model, scientifically referred to as the trans-theoretical model of change. Right? Now, what this model presents, as you can see, is 6 distinct behavioral stages. So yes, it is a sequential progression through stages of behavior where each stage is typified or characterized by unique behavioral traits. And the idea is that we want to progress from left to right to termination. Now, termination doesn't imply anything negative necessarily. What it implies is that there is almost zero likelihood of you ever relapsing or ceasing this behavior. Take brushing your teeth, for example. You may miss an occasional toothbrushing maybe in the evening because you've fallen asleep, but it's not a behavior that you're ever going to cease to do. You're going to continue to do this behavior indefinitely. So that's ultimately where we strive to go with healthy behaviors. Now, the way this model is presented is that it demonstrates that we can progress from left to right, but at the same time we can relapse going right to left. And this is very evident, for example, with New Year's resolutions, where someone may be thinking about it at the end of the year. Come the start of the year, they jump into some sort of behavioral action, and they're kind of participating, and then because they didn't have much of a structured plan and they didn't have kind of a routine, they kind of the wheels come off, so to speak, and they kind of relapse backwards to doing what? Not participating and thinking about it once again, and this cycle can kind of repeat itself on an annual basis. So this model is probably the most commonly cited model that goes about explaining how people will adopt and sustain healthy behaviors. Now, while it's universally referred to, it's not without its limitations or its criticism. 2 specific examples are, number one, that it arbitrarily assigns timelines for how long we spend in each stage, and that's absolutely not true. Why? Because the reality is you might be stuck in a stage indefinitely. Like cigarette smokers, for example, might, be in a certain stage just for a few months, whereas others could be there for years. What this model also lacks is that it doesn't really consider the influence of environment. The environment around us has a huge influence on the decisions and actions that we make. So what we're going to do is take that model and kind of strip it down to something more simple. We're going to talk about really 3 stages that move us to starting a new behavior. We're going to talk about this idea of resistance. We're going to talk about ambivalence and how at some point we want to move towards action. So once we get to action, now we're starting the process of adopting the new healthy behavior or the healthy habit. So what we have to do is to recognize what is resistance, what is ambivalence, and how do we move to action. So changing behavior is not easy. No one ever said it was. And if it was as easy as flipping a light switch, frankly, you could do it anytime, any place, anywhere. And we know that some behavioral change, especially if it's coerced, can be done for a short term. But something that we're asking ourselves or others to do for some sort of sustainable period of time cannot be forced upon us, nor can it just be adopted. It has to kind of go through this systematic process like we saw in the previous slide with these stages. Where do we start? Well, we start with really being true to yourself and assessing whether you are ready to commit to this behavioral process, because changing behavior, as I said, is not easy. It takes a significant investment of time, energy, resources, and other things to really start this, but more importantly, see it through. And so what we need to do is to kind of recognize whether we are truly committed to this. And we start with identifying where are we in the state of behavioral change. Are we resistant? Are we ambivalent? Or are we ready to move to action? Or are we ready to adopt a new behavior? Everyone has a unique point of entry. Now, once we identify your state, or we recognize or identify our own state, then we have to realize, well, there's some strategies now that we have to implement in order to move forward, either to overcome resistance or to overcome ambivalence and to move towards action. And in there, we're going to have a conversation about this word intention. Very powerful determinant of whether we're actually going to move forward or whether we're just kind of spinning our wheels thinking about it. So we have to then assess the strength of your intention. Because ultimately, if we can strengthen your intention, that favors your decisional balance of moving forward. And then we can proceed into the next step, which is setting our expectations and the kind of idea of goal setting, things that we will talk about later in these chapters. And that kind of starts the process of creating structure and support and a routine around what it is we're trying to do. So let's start with a conversation on resistance and ambivalence. Now, as you see at the bottom of the slide, one thing that really separates the two is the idea of intention. So we'll get to that shortly, but let's start with just these two terms. Now, a person who's resistant, right, we generally say they don't have intention to change. They might talk the talk. I might preach to you why I want to change. I might, think in my mind that I want to change, but because I truly am not committed to the change process, I don't have that strength of intention. It's just words. There's no action happening here. So why are people resistant? Well, for for various reasons. It might be something as simple as, I've tried this before and I failed. What if I fail again? I didn't like failing. And you know what? Failing made me angry, frustrated, and desperate, and I don't want to go through that again. So I'm not going to change. It might be that I'm miserable where I am now, and my perception of what I'm going to be doing is also just as miserable, so why even go through the process of staying miserable? It might be that you're going to take away my choices. In order for me to make choice, either you or myself have to restrict what I'm able to do. In other words, I can't go to dinner with my friends. I'm not going to be able to have ice cream when I want to. Things of that nature. You're taking away my freedom to choose, my autonomy of choice. And so I'm going to rebel. That's what people do. Humans value freedoms. And as a human who values freedoms, if you perceive, whether it's truthful or not, perception or reality, if you perceive your right to choose as being threatened, what do you think you do? You dig your heels in to fight for remaining freedoms. So you become more resistant. It could be people just rationalizing. Yeah, I can hear everyone telling me that change is going to be beneficial, but I see so many other people who don't do anything and look, they're just fine. So there's various reasons why people will have their justification for why inaction is okay, or inaction is the better cause. And as long as they are rationalizing, as long as you are rationalizing your inaction, you're never going to change. We call this sustained talk. You are providing your logical rationale that supports your inaction. You are engaging in sustained talk that justifies why no change is okay, why no change is merited. And until you shift that away from sustained talk, right, it's never going to amount to anything. And so how do I know if I'm listening to, how do I know that you are demonstrating sustained talk? How do I know that you're resistant? It's not just me listening to you. Listen to yourself. You're playing the role of victim. What you're doing here is when I ask you, or you ask yourself, if you don't like it, change. And then we ask ourselves, why won't we change? And we start throwing all these ideas out there. Well, it's because I don't have access and it's inconvenient and I don't have the time and there's just no, options available to me. It's not my fault. They do this and they do that and I can't do this. And it's not because of me. It's because of everything outside of me. In other words, I don't control the situation. The locus of control of this situation is outside of me. As long as you think you're the victim, there's no intention to change. You're going to need to shift that mindset to where you accept and take accountability that this is your choice and now you have to explore your options. And that's what ambivalence is. In ambivalence, the person has intention to change. Perhaps the reasons they have not started change yet is because they don't know what to do. They lack the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities. Or their perceptions of what they're going to do, they're maybe unclear or uncertain about what it looks like or maybe whether that'll be enjoyable. Or could be something where they believe, right, that I don't quite know what I'm going to get out of this. I'm unclear on what I'm going to expect by doing this. And that's what I'm hoping, that as you go through these chapters in reading, I help you create that clarity. I help you understand the why, so that you can then start building the what and the how. So you develop the knowledge and the skills, right? You start to get more clarity in terms of what the outcomes will look like. You start to shift your mindset. Now, what's interesting about resistance and ambivalence when we compare it to willpower, because a lot of people think, well, don't I just need willpower to do things? Well, yes, willpower is a very important trait that helps people sustain behaviors. But the difference between resistance and ambivalence and willpower is that willpower reflects a behavior that you're currently performing. Resistance and ambivalence, by comparison, reflect behaviors that have not yet been started. And so we're trying to get those wheels turning. And so if someone's resistant, we got to move them to ambivalence. Now, if they're ambivalent, as I said, they have intention, and what you'll hear is if you're now talking to someone or you're listening to your own internal narrative, your dialogue, it won't sound like I'm a victim. It's going to sound more like this process of what we call self-discovery and self-exploration, where you are exploring ideas. Can I do this? Would I be able to do more of this? Can I do a little bit of this and yet be able to do some of that? And we call that change talk. So the person who's ambivalent has kind of shifted a little bit, where there may still be some sustained talk, certain things where they're justifying their inaction, but there's also accompanying that what we call change talk, which speaks to prospecting the future. And so the difference is intention. And what we now need to do is to strengthen that intention to the best of our abilities. Right? But before we do that, one thing that is helpful, something that I do when I'm working with, coaching individuals, but something I can also do with myself, is to try and identify the type of ambivalence that I'm experiencing regarding this change process. Because if I do understand my type of ambivalence, what I can then do is kind of strategize in terms of how I can shift that ambivalence in favor of change. We call the word discrepancy. I can build discrepancy. And the idea here is look at a set of scales. Let's assume my right hand represents my status quo, the current behaviors that I'm doing. And let's call them undesirable behaviors that I want to change. My left hand represents those desirable behaviors, those options that I'm exploring. Now, like a set of scales, if these two scales are in balance with each other, there's no reason to move forward, because there's no difference fundamentally between them. You see the pros and cons of each as being equal. So like a set of scales, I have to put more emphasis onto the alternative behavior, the desirable behavior, so I tilt those scales in favor of change. And so in doing that, I do a little exercise. The exercise is, number one, to identify the type of ambivalence that I have, and number two is how to shift my discrepancy in favor of the pros of change. And so when we talk about ambivalence, we can say, well, we really have various types of ambivalence. And the easy way to remember this is thinking of the words approach and avoidance. If you perceive a behavioral state as being appealing, whether it's the existing behavior or the proposed behavior, if you see appeal with it, we say that's an approach. If you see a lack of appeal, in other words, it's unappealing, we call it avoidance. So we fundamentally have four types here. The first one, it would be the problem I'd love to have my entire life, but it's very unlikely that this is what you're experiencing. I'll give you an example before I explain it. So imagine you have fun plans for Friday night to do something fun. And then Thursday afternoon, you get a call or a text from a friend who invites you because they have an extra ticket to this concert that you've always wanted to go see. But it just happens to conflict with your plans that you've already made for Friday night. So you have a little bit of a conflict here. You have a dilemma. I have two choices. Either way, I'm going to have a great time. Hence the word approach. So you're torn in making a decision because you're not sure which one to go with. There's ambivalence right there. But as I said, this is not a type of ambivalence that we experience very often because you're always going to come out on top here. This is usually a win-win. What we generally experience is the other ones. We experience what we call avoidance, where we look at both options and they both are unappealing. I could look at my current situation. I don't like the fact that I'm not living a healthy life. I am unhealthy, I'm lethargic, I don't have energy. I just feel like I'm a slob. The alternative, I could start getting myself into shape by working out, exercising, being more active, making some sacrifices. I could start eating healthy, going out to dinner less and preparing meals at home. None of that appeals to me. Both of them are unappealing. So in essence, we're talking about choosing the lesser of the two evils. Example I give you there is, you have to attend a meeting and you arrive and there's only one parking spot available. And it's a handicap spot. Now you have a choice. You could either risk parking illegally and getting a massive ticket but making your meeting, or you can wait in hopes that a parking spot opens up and then be late to the meeting where you might be reprimanded. Really comes down to the lesser of two evils. Now, the third type of ambivalence is one that maybe doesn't happen as often, but this is where we just speak to one of the two options. In other words, we could be focused on your existing behavior or purely on the alternative behavior. It could be, if I did exercise and eat better, I would feel more energized, I would feel more productive at work, I would feel more productive at school, I'd feel better about myself. But the idea of exercising, the idea of sacrificing time to go to the gym, the idea of no longer going out to dinner with my friends and having to prepare meals at home and counting my calories, none of that appeals to me. So I have a love-hate relationship with this proposed behavior. Or in my example, it could be the status quo. I know alcohol is bad for me, but when I do drink, I feel less inhibited and I feel fun. I feel like I have fun. So it's a love-hate relationship with one or the other, not both. That is called double, right? And that is sometimes what we do have. We have the fourth alternative, which is we look at both situations. So I'm using my set of scales again, and I have a love-hate relationship with the current behavior, and I also have a love-hate relationship with the proposed alternative. Now, what I need to do is, through a little bit of self-discovery, just thinking through things, I can quickly ascertain what type of ambivalence am I dealing with here. And most of the times it's, I don't like my current situation. I also don't like the perception of what I can do. So we have avoidance. That's probably the most common. And here's what you got to do. You have to think creatively, but legitimately as well, to hate the existing behavior more or love it less. And then you've got to look at the proposed alternative and love it more and hate it less. So how do I do that? Well, let's go back to my cigarette smoker. If my cigarette smoker knows that smoking is bad for his or her health, that might not be enough to do what? Hate it enough. So I've got to creatively think about other things that could be contributing negatively to cigarette smoking. And it might be, well, when I smoke, it gives me bad breath. When I smoke, I get cigarette smoke on my clothes. And when I go into my meetings or I go around my peers and my friends, they give me repulsive looks. And it's kind of embarrassing. I feel embarrassed. We got to find as many reasons as we can to hate it more and love it less. I know it calms me down, so that's why I like smoking, but there's other ways I can find myself to calm down. I don't need to resort to smoking when I have all that smoke and stink and everything. I need to find other ones. I don't love it as much and I hate it more. But we go to the other side. This is behaviors that, I just don't like those behaviors. Well, let's find actions that you do enjoy doing. What would be some things you'd be inclined to do or want to do that you find enjoyable? Let's look at those. So that's kind of what we do. So again, if you decide, being honest with yourself, I'm taking accountability, I have intention to change, I'm just kind of sitting on the fence, you might want to assess what kind of ambivalence am I experiencing so that you can create the discrepancy where you tilt the scales in favor of changing as opposed to maintaining or remaining in the status quo. Now, we have one more step to do before we can kind of move towards action. That is this idea of intention. So the theory of planned behavior really speaks to the idea that it is intention that drives our behavior. And the stronger the intention, the more likely we are to perform the behavior. It's one of the premises of this model. So the question is, what influences intention? Well, the authors of this model identified 3 key areas. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to just talk about particular statements. First thing would be, do you perceive this change to be beneficial to you or harmful to you? And number 2, do you think you're going to enjoy doing it? But here's the catch. Use a scoring system, maybe 1 through 5, like you see on the table right there. Now, how you score yourself is going to be absolutely critical, because if you say, yes, this is going to do more benefits. So look at my example. Do you believe introducing more grains and vegetables into your diet will improve your health? I say yes. 5. I do believe that. But will you enjoy eating a variety of different grains and vegetables? No. A 1. You've got a problem. As much as you recognize it's beneficial, you won't enjoy it. So therefore, there's no congruency here. You're probably not going to start or stick this thing out. You have to get them both to be congruent with each other. In other words, they both need to be 5s. So how do you do that? Well, you're going to have to think creatively. If this is what you want to do, in other words, introduce more grains and vegetables, you're going to have to figure out ways to enjoy grains and vegetables more. Is it maybe the way they're prepared? Is it certain vegetables that you purchase? You're going to have to figure that out, because until you do that and you have incongruency in those scores, you don't have strength of intention, which means you might start, but what is the likelihood of you sticking this through? Not great. Another area that can influence your intention is whether you have a support system. Are there people who advocate, who support, endorse what it is you're trying to do? In other words, do they look at this as being, exemplary, and they support what you're doing? And more importantly, will they participate? Are they currently doing it, or will they participate with you? In other words, they won't just talk the talk, will they walk the walk? That is going to be important too, because you're going to need to have a support system, or people that you respect or see as credible endorsing what you do. Can you imagine you go to a doctor's office who tells you that you need to lose weight and eat healthy, and then you walk outside and there's the doctor smoking a cigarette and drinking a beer? They're not role modeling, which means they've just lost all credibility, which means someone who I'm supposed to respect and maybe admire, perhaps see as a role model, has really just done what? Lost all credibility, which means I don't have that exemplary role model who advocates that I can actually, believe in. But the most important one is really this idea of control. Is this your choice? And this is where we come back to sustained talk. If you ever hear, or in your own mind, if your rationale, if your narrative in your brain is, I need to do this, I have to do this, I've been told I need to do this, you don't control this behavior. Someone or something else is controlling the behavior. Until you can honestly say, I choose to do this, I want to do this, I desire to do this, then you don't have strength of intention. Because if you control this behavior, it's because you're choosing to do it. So the 2 questions you really should get to the crux of here is, number 1 is this a behavior you choose to do? And number 2, when things get tough, are you going to be able to stick this thing through? In other words, when faced with adversity, are you going to be able to maintain this behavior? Again, only you can answer these questions. And what you need to do is to kind of create a template similar to this, where you just ask yourself these simple questions. Do I see more benefit than harm? Will I enjoy this? Is there some measure of a support system, people who will support, endorse, and maybe even participate with me? Then, do I have control? Is this my choice? Do I have control of what I choose to do? Or is this something I'm doing out of obligation? And how likely am I to stick this thing through when I face adversity? With those questions, the way you got to answer them is they've all got to be congruent with each other. They've all got to be strong answers, because then that demonstrates you have the strength of intention to move forward. So before we move into the next slide, just a recap. You have an idea, perhaps in your mind, this is what I'd like to do. You have to take a moment to work through kind of your current state. We want to identify, where are you in your state of behavioral change? Am I ambivalent? Am I resistant? Where am I? Distinguish how you differentiate between resistance and ambivalence. It's listen to your own narrative. Are you presenting rationale where you're a victim, or are you exploring ideas? Sustain talk, change talk. If we are at that point of change talk where you're contemplating, exploring ideas, then we have to strengthen your intention. That's what we talked about here. And there's one kind of last step that we can do right here. It's a survey that's been created. It's one of many different surveys that kind of looks at your readiness to change. And it takes kind of a big picture approach. And what it's doing essentially is kind of looking at the different constructs that are really needed to support starting and sustaining behavior. The analogy I'll give you here, think of it as 10 pieces to a jigsaw puzzle. And you need to have enough of those pieces to be able to make sense of what the image looks like. We need to have enough of these structured or set up, right, where it'll help us embark on this new behavioral change. Now, look at the first question, for example. It says, your primary reason for changing behavior is for your benefit, not because someone else thinks you should. Well, how are you going to answer that? But what I like about the survey is that if you look at what follows behind the survey is a little opportunity to, again, self-explore how you answer that. If you answered that, I'm doing this to be a good role model for someone else. I'm doing this to win the approval of someone else, to get validation from someone else. Well, look at that answer. Although changing behavior to appease, inspire, win approval from someone else is important, it only drives short-term compliance. You need to have your own reasons for why you want to change behavior. Think of the mom who says, I want to be a good role model to my kids, so I want to do this to be a good role model for my kids. My follow-up question would be, what happens when your kids grow up and move away? Who are you doing it for? If you truly believe this is good behavior, then find your own reasons. So that survey that you just saw, the idea is to go through the questions, answer them truthfully, and then read through these, because what it'll help you be able to ascertain is whether you have that piece of the puzzle, so to speak, in place. And if you have more of these in place, chances are you're more likely to start and succeed in changing behavior.